Hello, everyone. Welcome to the TR2 World Forum Digital Debate Series, Designing the Future of Planet Earth Towards the Green Transition, which includes a series of discussions on trending issues of climate change and energy transition. My name is Sahin. I'm a researcher at TR2 World Forum, and today we will have the fourth session of our debate series with the title of how will the Green Deal change European foreign policy with my distinguished guests? The European Commission presented the European Green Deal in December 2019 with the aim of achieving continent-wide net zero emissions by 2050. Considering that fossil fuels still make up to 70% of the EU's energy mix, of which more than half is imported, the effects of massive decarbonisation in Europe would inherently entail shifts in foreign policy. As such, the deal entails implications for the wider continent too, as it would affect the EU's foreign policy towards its current energy partners, including producer and transit countries. Given this, what future alterations should we expect in the EU's foreign policy vis-a-vis the Green Deal? To discuss this question and more, joining me today, we have Stientje van Veldhoven, the Vice President and Regional Director for Europe at World Resource Institute. Ms. van Veldhoven has been a prominent politician in the Netherlands, most recently serving as a member of cabinet responsible for public transport and environment, and as Minister for the Environment and Housing. She has also been a member of parliament, an international diplomat, representing the Dutch government in the European Union in Brussels, and has been working with the European Commission Directorate General, Research and Development. Ms. van Veldhoven has had long-lasting involvement in environmental issues, especially related to climate change and the circular economy. It's a pleasure to host you, Ms. van Veldhoven. Thank you for coming. And we host Christophe van Acht, the Director of Energy Dialogue at the International Energy Forum. Mr. van Acht leads IEF programs that advance producer and consumer countries' energy dialogue and collaboration through IEF ministerial fora, stakeholder meetings with partner organizations, and other government platforms such as the G20. His work at the IEF includes coordination of the trilateral work program with the IEA and OPEC, as well as collaboration on energy security, market transparency, and orderly and inclusive transitions with other institutions, industry stakeholders, national agencies, and resource centers. Prior to joining the IEF, Mr. Van Acht also worked at Klingendal International Energy Program, International Energy Agency, Energy Charter, and European Commission External Relations Directorate. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Van Acht.
You're welcome.
Next to him, Mr. Adam Berman is with us. Mr. Berman is the European Policy Director at the International Emissions Trading Association. At IETA, he advocates for market solutions to climate change. In this position, he provides analysis and advice on European climate policy, with a particular emphasis on the EU's emissions trading system and related policies. Before IETA, he worked as an analyst in the energy industry on international climate policy issues. Mr. Berman began his career working on environmental policy in the Parliament of the United Kingdom. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Berman. Indeed, being an aspiring energy expert, I'm excited to host such speakers with immense knowledge and experience in the field. I want to open up the discussion with you, Ms. van Veldhoven. The shift to carbon neutrality by 2050 will reshape the way energy is produced and consumed in the EU. Given that today almost three-fourths of the EU's energy needs come from fossil fuels, what are the major foreign policy issues that are to feel the most impact from the shifts associated with the EU's Green Deal?
Thank you so much for this question. I think, first of all, acknowledging that 75% means that there is a great challenge, but also a great opportunity. Second, let's say, high-level remark that I'd like to make is when we talk about carbon neutrality, that doesn't necessarily mean zero carbon in the energy mix, right? Because it's carbon neutrality in emissions. So CCS and nuclear, for example, are likely to also play an important role in the mix. So foreign policy issues, of course, there's many foreign policies that you could think of. I think the European Green Deal will have a great influence in setting the direction of financial flows, both in Europe, but also outside of Europe. Because the current technology will not provide us with energy security. We will need to see new technologies developing, new investments being made in energy technology, especially, of course, storage and infrastructure. So I think the financial flows will be one of those directions that will be heavily impacted. Then, of course, if the import of fossil fuels is reduced, that might, of course, have different impact on different countries within the European Union, but it will certainly make the overall coordination sometimes easier, because even though Europe has very, very ambitious European goals, energy policy is still very much national energy policies implementing these EU goals, and those policies differ widely. If only you look across the spectrum of the use of natural gas, with, for example, the Netherlands going more out of gas and perhaps back into nuclear, Germany going out of nuclear, Belgium going into gas. So lots of different national policies, but all adding up to those European goals. And then I think, of course, also trade policies. If you think about the border protection mechanism, creating a level playing field, I know we'll be talking more about that in the rest of this debate, is also, I think, a very important policy that will be part of the foreign policies implemented. I think there is something that I'd like to highlight at the beginning of this debate is how crucial the next 5 to 7 years are. Crucial and strategically critical. The 2050 target is really too far to be actionable. So there's a level of urgency and expectation that renewable energies will be advanced along with storage and hydrogen and infrastructure. And nothing that we're doing is changing the demand curve as dramatically as it needs to be changed. So this also, in fact, needs to be a part of foreign policy. What do we do with the demand curve next to all of the technology developments and the trade implications and the national policy implications that then, of course, altogether also combine to European policies. So it's not just a question of what's the generation side of this energy debate, but also the other elements in this system transformation, because that will all in the end determine whether it is, for example, energy security.
Thank you, Ms. van Veldhoven. I want to continue with the EU's relations, actually. Mr. Van Acht, while Russia is perhaps the most prominent exporter of high-emission products to Europe, it is not the only country that stands to be impacted by Europe's move to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. Most notably in this regard, relations between the EU as well as its member states and countries such as Algeria, Saudi Arabia, Ukraine, Turkey, as well as Russia, China, and the United States. In your view, what are the main geopolitical repercussions of the Green Deal, and how is it set to redefine Europe's regional and international relations? In particular, how is likely to impact the EU's relations with energy producers in its immediate neighborhood?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question, which is a very complex and comprehensive question. I think, well, you know, it's great to join this TRT session, and this is a very pertinent question, which I think will be answered as we move forward in time. Today, elevated energy price volatility, the impact of ever more pressing climate and sustainable development goals, foreign policy and security challenges are all on full display. And indeed, they make a compelling case for us to come to terms with how change and transitions, such as proposed by the European Green Deal, will affect lives and livelihoods now and in the future. Taking a step back, I think the pandemic has indeed in 2020 inspired what I would call a new energy and climate solidarity to maintain market stability and accelerate a more inclusive and sustainable recovery, even at a time when prices and investment were at relative lows. This has changed. We indeed marked a high point here at the IEF when we hosted the Minister of Energy of Saudi Arabia, His Royal Highness Prince Abdul Aziz bin Salman Al Saud, together with the Executive Vice President of the European Commission responsible for the Green Deal, Frans Timmermans. And we look forward indeed to facilitating a next meeting this year indeed to get at these issues. And of course, we have the Glasgow Climate Summit that was quite successful. On the eve of that summit, G20 leaders gathered in Rome called on the IEF to intensify dialogue between producers and consumers, indeed to address exactly these questions and bolster the efficiency, transparency, and stability of energy markets to facilitate just and orderly transitions. Now, the EU's market and regulatory power make it the leading light for climate action and energy transitions. There are various proposals. We have the Fit for 55 proposals on the table that will implement the Green Deal. There are many issues out there, the taxonomy, which Stientje van Veldhoven already referred to, but also, for instance, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And I would imagine indeed that this latter proposal has indeed inspired EU trade partners to adopt similar net zero targets and take similar measures to remain competitive vis-a-vis the EU. So there already you see the EU's power in action. 130 countries have now set or are considering net zero targets by mid-century. And maybe even more important, rules on carbon trade, Paris Article 6, have been agreed. So on the other hand, the unprecedented price rises we see today risk slow tracking the global economic recovery from the pandemic, and they may even deepen economic social disparities with EU trade partners. And that can in turn erode this energy and climate solidarity on which the European Green Deal's success relies. So here indeed, I think engagement with foreign partners such as Russia and partners on the southern flank in the Mediterranean and beyond, indeed, is crucial. The European Green Deal's objective is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to achieve climate neutrality mid-century. Before it will reduce fossil fuel demand, it will alter, of course, the nature of these, I would not call it import dependencies, but I think it's import and export codependencies. And that's a very important point as well. So this calls for greater engagement and collaboration, both domestically, of course, within the EU and with Russia and other foreign partners and beyond, to ensure that we achieve an orderly transition that is just and that works for all. So my thinking is that indeed the European Green Deal's implementation must align with the four freedoms of the single market: free movement of goods, capital, service, and persons, and of course the external trade, investment, and development policy stance based on non-discriminatory multilateral trade rules, neighborhood and partnership agreements that together will shape the EU's foreign policy and security stance. Now, the jury is still out, I think, on whether the European Union, to what degree there will be changes in any of these areas. and how it will indeed show global leadership on climate and sustainable growth. And here, of course, a hotly debated issue is the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and in a way the taxonomy as well, more or less a style guide for sustainable investment and financing, or a de facto green energy industrial policy. So I think the European Union has a choice to either become a green bastion that will impose choices on others and increase friction and vulnerabilities in its direct neighborhood and beyond. In particular, as I mentioned, the southern areas. And that may not do much to increase the EU's global standing or even meet the challenges which it is set out to respond to. So I think the alternative is to become a green lighthouse that, together with the other green lighthouses out there in Asia, in Africa, here in the Middle East, where new initiatives have been taken, such as the Saudi Green Initiative, the Middle East Green Initiative. There's a lot happening in other countries, Morocco, Egypt, and Russia, of course, to lead the world along the many and varied pathways to meet shared climate and sustainable development goals. So implementation of the Green Deal is not a closed lab experiment, but an intergenerational and multi-factor undertaking in the real world. And it will continue to raise all manner of issues at all levels of society, at home and abroad. So building trust and confidence through realism, reciprocity, regular reviews and recalibration, in foreign policy and security relations as well, is a good starting point.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mr. Fanat. It was indeed a really complex question, so there are many answers, but you are doing good. Thank you.
Good to hear.
Mr. Berman, I want to ask about the partnerships of the EU. Actually, there remain somewhat divergent views around what qualifies as green energy and what does not, particularly as it relates to natural gas and nuclear energy. For example, Austria has banned nuclear power plants, but nevertheless imports nuclear energy from abroad and is, along with Germany, particularly dependent on natural gas imports from Russia. How are these issues being dealt with within the EU? And how might the results of these discussions impact existing partnerships?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I think what's happening very quickly for anyone in the kind of climate space and in the trade space more broadly is a realization that climate and energy issues are becoming a really central concern. And I think it's worth sort of highlighting that there has been a real shift in terms of kind of European policy. I think a shift from a domestic focus of climate and energy. If you go back, even 3 or 4 years and you ask senior European policymakers, tell me about European climate policy, they would say, oh, well, it's just one of many policy items we're dealing with on the agenda. It's primarily domestic. We have a target. We'll put in place the mechanisms. And that was really about it. We're now shifting to more of a sense that there's actually an international aspect to European climate and energy policy, where Europe can actually leverage the European Green Deal and climate policy for its foreign policy ends. And so, Christoph and Stientje have both discussed the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which I think from a political sense, I think probably will happen in some shape or form. And I think that's a shift from just a domestic concern, particularly about carbon pricing, to an international concern that when the EU says, if you aren't tackling climate adequately within your own jurisdiction and you trade with us, we will penalize you with it. That's effectively what this mechanism means. This has also been true of the maritime sector as well. Europe has has essentially never had any regulations on decarbonisation of the maritime sector. And now we have two major initiatives which essentially price the carbon in the maritime sector for the first time. And again, it is the EU saying to third countries, if you won't decarbonise the maritime sector, then we'll do it for you. So I think ultimately this is probably a continuation of a kind of broader European regulatory agenda, but of course it's foreign policy by proxy. I don't think that yet this is a joined up approach in Europe. I'm not entirely sure whether this is sort of explicit or implicit, whether, you know, we really do have a strong connection between, you know, the EEAS, the European External Action Service, who effectively kind of deal with the European foreign policy, and then also the different kind of departments that deal with energy and climate, DG Klima, NR, Taxud. But it is happening almost certainly. The one thing I think you talked about partnerships, I think the one real question for me at the moment is about energy security. And I think what's happened as we've seen this shift over the last couple of years has been, as others have said, there is a remarkable degree of political consensus around the need for climate action in Europe. But there hasn't been a great deal of discussion of, well, okay, if we do shift to these lower carbon or zero carbon alternatives, what are the ramifications in terms of energy security? And I think that's particularly, you know, being highlighted at the moment with the situation around gas, both in relation to kind of global gas prices and of course, Ukraine. So ultimately, I think that there is this real change in terms of partnerships and the way in which the EU is dealing with third countries in relation to climate and energy. And I think, if anything, it's going to get more serious over time, because ultimately, you know, I think, again, you know, to Christoph's point, I think a few years ago, there was the sense that EU was just a green bastion. But if the EU wants to shift to, in Christoph's analogy of being a green lighthouse, then I think ultimately they will have to have more difficult conversations with key trading partners about how to both kind of share expertise and best practice, but also say, if you will not move fast enough, then we will have to put in measures to adequately deal with those, let's say, carbon intensive imports into our jurisdiction, or, you know, more broadly, we will have to kind of design our foreign policy around that. So I think there is a real shift taking place, and it's not just in the future, it's already happening.
Thank you, Mr. Berman. Speaking of energy security, Ms. van Veldhoven, I want to ask you a question about this. Ultimately, climate policy is intensely geopolitical, with both cooperative and coercive elements. The extent of the movement away from fossil fuels that the Green Deal proposes would, of course, effectively solve the issues surrounding European energy security that we are witnessing in real time today. But there will be also new risks to be created. What are the implications of the Green Deal for European energy security, both in the near to midterm and as we approach the 2050 objective of carbon neutrality?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. I think it follows perfectly also on what, for example, Adam Berman has said and Christoph van Achten said, because when you say it's intensely geopolitical, I'd like to say yes. It is intensely geopolitical in the sense that we only have one planet. And we can get it right or we can get it wrong. In that sense, it's very geopolitical because we only have one planet. And so all of our actions together will determine whether we have a solution or a massive problem that we have no longer any way to tackle. And I want to stress again how important the next 10 years, even less than 10 years, are to tackle all of this. So we need to look beyond the short-term economic interests. If we get it wrong, we all have a massive economic problem, right? We have problems now, but we'll have more massive economic problems later if we get this wrong. The second element I want to say, taking up on what Mr. Berman said about the transition to renewables and, let's say, the current problems with energy security. I think it would be very false to link those two immediately, right? I don't think he intended to do that, but I think we all know that there are other reasons than the transition to renewables that create this current situation in the European energy market. But it is, of course, crucial that we do take account of energy security as part of our architecture of this transition to renewables, right? And that means that we have to diversify, we have to electrify, We have to develop storage. So all of these things, and we also have to manage demand, right? Energy efficiency will mean that we will get to energy security sooner than if we don't also focus on energy efficiency. And that is something where there's actually relatively little focus on. So this diversification of sources also means that you might actually have new trading partners, right? You might have new connections with countries developing hydrogen on a large scale and importing and exporting such instead of fossil fuel. So we're going out of fossil energy, but the world will still need a lot of energy. Actually, our energy demand continues to grow year by year. We only need to make sure that its carbon intensity drops down year by year, and it needs to drop down quickly. So I think the implications of the European Green Deal actually mean that we will have a different way of ensuring our energy security. It doesn't mean that energy security will no longer be an issue. And I also think that energy security should be there in the architecture of this just transition right from the start. And one final word connecting to what Mr. Van Acht said about the wider implication and linking it to my one planet. This is not something that Europe can solve alone, right? The rest of the world will also need to get to a path of decarbonization of the energy transition. And Europe should also think about what is the role that we can play in helping them to go through that transition, because it will help us too. Being this one planet, we need to make sure that we also enable others through the technology that has been developed, but also, for example, and I know we're going to talk about the just transition a bit more in the rest of the debate. I think this element of just transition is also really crucial. Others are not necessarily unwilling, but they may be unable to take the same steps at the same speed. That doesn't mean that we need to lower our ambitions, but that does mean that we need to increase our initiatives for helping others to go along. And I look forward to discussing that further with you too.
Thank you, Ms. van Veldhoven. We just mentioned some keywords: dependency, diversification, geopolitics, and it reminds me, actually, it brings me to Russia for the EU. Mr. Van Acht, given the current dependence of Europe, particularly Germany, on natural gas imports from Russia, does the Green Deal offer a realistic path to emancipation from this dependency? In what ways would this impact EU-Russian relations?
Well, I think first of all, we want to be clear that the European Green Deal is indeed first and foremost about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That does not necessarily immediately equate to reducing fossil fuel dependency, as also Stientje van Veldhoven mentioned in her opening remarks. There are many technologies, carbon capture, use and storage, of course, other gases and conversions that will apply. And indeed, Russia, together with other trade partners around the European Union's periphery and beyond, play a key role in maintaining energy security. And I don't think that is going to change in the coming decade. But indeed, it will alter the relationship, and it will alter, the technological requirements on which this dependency on foreign fossil fuel products will evolve. I think what is really important to note is that we cannot achieve climate neutrality without safeguarding basic securities and sharing prosperity first. We're all in this together. This is one planet. And I think also we have to acknowledge that we're equal partners in this game. So that really does require much more dialogue and more engagement on a level basis with partners such as Russia in this regard. So these partners, not only Russia, but also North American energy exporters, all have a voice in this and will be, have questions about indeed how a carbon border adjustment mechanism will affect their prosperity or their revenues that they depend on for these fossil fuel exports. I think there's a lot of, to get more into technical area, there is a lot of issues apart from the trade law issues. There are a lot of technical issues. How do you measure carbon intensity? How do you report, monitor, and validate carbon flows? These are all issues that are tremendously complex and where we need to do a lot of work. The IEF, for one, of course, is trying to get or to help in this domain with building more initiatives on transparent carbon markets. But I think dialogue is really key here. Yeah, the demand for gas is again on full display today. The European Union may indeed, well, still also needs a lot of this gas to enable coal to gas switching. But in the non-OECD world, gas really is the best next thing to renewables if you're heavily dependent on coal. So what is sustainable in one context may not be sustainable in another. So we have to also acknowledge that, you know, there are all kinds of contextual sensitivities that determine what the sustainable and secure energy fuel mix will be. And there, I think we need to make sure that we have room and accept that there are differences here.
Thank you, Mr. Van Acht. Mr. Berman, actually, in a sense, the Green Deal represents a redefinition of the European economy, and as a result will reshape not only the Union's international relations, but those of its member states as well. This, of course, will entail a redefinition of European policy priorities, particularly in the realm of environmental policies. What are the key environmental policy areas that Europe will have to engage with its international partners on in order to make the green transition and success, as well as mitigate its risks?
Sure. Well, firstly, let me just respond to Stientje's point, which I thought, you know, was absolutely right, that, you know, this is not a zero-sum game. The economy is changing anyway. So when we talk about energy security, it's not just one thing. Energy security will shift over time. I think when it comes to the kind of key environmental issues, I mean, I think we seem to be coalescing around trade. And I think that there's a good reason for that. I think ultimately, what the EU has tried to do with the carbon border adjustment mechanism, but with a set of other kind of more regulatory policies as well, is to kickstart a discussion about what a kind of legitimate trade policy looks like when you factor in climate change. I think ultimately the reason they have done that is that the trade agenda has not moved in step with the climate agenda. I mean, I don't think it would be particularly controversial to say that this has not been at the top of the WTO's list. You know, there have been various people who occasionally say, well, we must have a climate waiver, but, you know, we haven't yet got close to that. So I think ultimately trade is probably going to be where the EU focuses in terms of its efforts in this space. And I think one thing that the CBAM has really done, which to me highlights the benefits or the advantages of the kind of efforts that the EU has been making so far, is, as Christoph said earlier, the effect that the carbon border adjustment mechanism has already had and is continuing to have with key trading partners. So if we look at a list of who are the key trading partners who are affected by the carbon border adjustment mechanism, we got right up at the top of the list: Russia, Turkey. The UK, slightly less significant in this context because the UK already has an ambitious climate agenda, but also China as well. Each of those key jurisdictions, there has been some clear response. In Russia, there have been senior officials who've said, oh, well, perhaps actually we will, you know, speed up our ambition, or perhaps we will introduce a national carbon pricing structure. In Turkey as well, there have been similar discussions. In China, there is a national carbon pricing system which began in July this year. At the moment, it only covers the power sector in China. But for example, steel, China exports about half of the world's steel. and a good percentage of it ends up in the European Union. China has said that they may be willing to actually include more sectors in this carbon pricing structure more quickly than they had originally envisaged. With Turkey, I remember just before COP26, it was made clear by one of the Turkish officials that the reason that the Paris Agreement had been ratified by Turkey was because of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Now, of course, different countries will try and do different things. They will try and say, oh, well, could I do this policy to try and evade the CBAM? Could I do this this policy? Others will really rise to the challenge and say, actually, we do want to have these levels of ambition, and we will take whatever assistance we can get. We will really push towards this. But I think ultimately it is going to be trade where the EU is probably aiming for, because when we talk about foreign policy, still, we're talking about a coherent European foreign policy, but the idea of a coherent European foreign policy is a relatively new development. And so I think when we're talking about climate energy, the way that Europe will continue to do things is from a regulatory perspective. But there are also, I think, areas where we can see that Europe is trying to not just create a kind of one singular solution like the carbon border adjustment mechanism, but also go to specific bilateral relationships and actually say, all right, what is a bilateral solution that we could take to a problem? So I think most recently that would be on the EU-US agreement on steel and aluminium, which has essentially created a framework for the way in which steel and aluminium can be traded between the two countries. It almost creates a sort of bilateral border carbon adjustment, or at least a framework for it. And it says that the two countries will agree to work together on how to calculate the carbon intensity of these products, how to sort of equate them with the EU's carbon price. So these are bilateral mechanisms. The carbon border adjustment mechanism is more of a sort of plurilateral or multilateral mechanism. So I think the EU will probably continue to go down this path and continue to find these primarily trade solutions, because that's ultimately where the EU's power is. It's in as being one of the global kind of regulatory setting bodies.
Thank you, Mr. Berman. There are a lot of issues to focus on. Actually, I'm kind of confused how to continue with this, but I think I want to dig into this carbon border adjustment mechanisms. Ms. van Veldhoven, the drive for carbon neutrality entails a certain amount of risk for European producers vis-a-vis competitors that are not facing the same pressures in terms of carbon production, which has engendered a discussion around the introduction of carbon border adjustment mechanisms, as we already mentioned. These, of course, pose a certain degree of risk as it relates to the global trading system and has the potential to engender less than positive international reactions, particularly from countries that export emission-intensive goods to the EU. What can EU governments do to mitigate these concerns of its partners?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think the key about the carbon border adjustment mechanism is you can either get it completely right or you can get it very wrong. So it's not a question for me on whether there should be something like a carbon border adjustment mechanism, but what should it look like? And I think the comment that Adam just made about, let's say, the example in the bilateral atmosphere is already a very good example of how you can also work together to define the mechanism in a way that both actually see this as fair. Because this is all about fair competition in a world which has to step up action on climate change. And that is a public good that the European Union is working towards. So it would not be fair either to let the rest of the world piggyback on, let's say, the efforts that are being made in Europe, right? It's not for its own economic gain that the European Union is stepping up climate change measures, thereby imposing extra costs also in its own industry. They do that for the global good of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So then it's only fair that they also ask for a fair trade deal, basically, for their companies that they're imposing these measures and these regulations on. So you can get it right or you can get it wrong. They should get it right. And how do you get it right? Through extensive dialogue. I think that's absolutely crucial. Then next to CBAM, there's also, let's say, other measures that you can take. You could say that with, for example, the revenues of CBAM, you try to help other regions that are less developed or that have less capacity to develop on their own, to help them on this route. And I think one thing that I found, this is of course in the energy sector, but one example that I found very, very giving a lot of hope actually at the last COP in Glasgow was the initiative by the EU, France, Germany, the UK, and the US together, but look at this combination of partners, to announce an 8.5 billion package of grants and concessional finance over 3 to 5 years to accelerate the retirement of coal-fired power plants and the development of renewable energy, and also, crucially, targeting economic regeneration in coal mining regions. So providing an alternative for the people that actually work in these sectors, because it's not just, let's say, large industrial complexes generating, large volumes of energy. These are places where people work and people depend on these jobs for their livelihood. So if we want to accelerate this change, we need to make sure we get the trade rules right. We also need to make sure that we get the balance right between the developed world and the developing countries. And that means that we need to help them, not just the governments, but very much also the people whose livelihood depends on these fossil fuel sectors. If we can get them to embrace the transition because they see that they will also have a job in the future, then together we can also speed up, and that will also have its effect on foreign policy dialogues, of course, aggregated again at the governmental level. So we can get it very much right, or we can get it very much wrong, but we need to step up. And I think, like you already outlined, this carbon mechanism is a way also to accelerate the debate and to accelerate the way in which also other countries are being forced to at least think about it. And I think if we see the challenge ahead, this is the challenge for our generation. The time that we have left is really, really short. It is time for these things that help us accelerate our thinking and our action.
Thank you, Ms. van Veldhoven. Mr. Van Aert, the shift to renewables not only implies a move away from fossil fuels, but also increased usage of rare earth materials. As it stands today, the main exporter of these resources is China. What does this shift mean both for European energy security in the future and for relations between the EU and China?
Well, that's a very good question. And actually, it follows up nicely on our discussion on the CBAM, because it also points to the importance that Mrs. van Veldhoven mentioned of getting the CBAM right. And we will, because it's a gradual process. And of course, there will be extensive dialogue, which is already happening here and beyond, also in government settings. If we get it wrong, then indeed you get into a scenario where other producers of, for instance, critical minerals or any other goods that the EU depends on, retaliate, and we increase trade barriers and other hurdles to investment, which is really not what we need at the moment, because we're all trying to recover from the impacts of the pandemic and to get on a sustainable track of growth. Free trade, even if it is complex and there are a lot of issues in the WTO and elsewhere on that agenda, is a cumbersome and very complicated process, but it is essential that we stay the course there. Because indeed, we live in an interconnected world, and for this transition to work, indeed, the EU will become more dependent on other areas and other materials, not only exported from China, but also African countries, Latin America, to facilitate the rollout of renewable energies. I think one of the quid pro quos is also simply development and technology transfer. These are very important issues to help trade partners step up, and also, mind you, there's a lot that we can get from trade partners on technology advances. Again, I just want to underline that this is a collective process. I think indeed it is right for the EU to more or less lay down the gauntlet here with the CBAM and other measures. And I think this is a process, and it is important that we work together to get these things right.
Thank you, Mr. Van Acht. Mr. Burman, when we just started talking about bilateral relations, and I want to ask a question to you about EU-UK relations. The EU has in place an emissions trading system which provides a carbon price to encourage decarbonisation across the Union. So far, the ETS has been treated primarily as a domestic mechanism, but in 2020, linkage was achieved between the EU and Swiss ETS, and there is speculation that it could be expanded further to include other third countries. What prospects might there be for the EU to use carbon markets as a foreign policy tool, particularly in the light of agreement on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and what will be the relation between EU and the UK regarding the ETS?
Sure. Well, now it's a really interesting question, and this is early days because we've only just finalised Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So just for those that may not be so familiar with it, the way that the Paris Agreement is constructed is essentially as a set of domestic commitments. Countries agree to achieve certain targets. There is really very little scope for countries to actually interact with one another in the framework of the Paris Agreement. But yet we know that some countries have certain advantages. Let's say you might have an abundance of hydropower. Let's say you might have open space that could be in a warm country close to the equator that could be used for renewables. Every country will have some sort of natural advantage, will have some sort of situation that they could exploit. So what Article 6 of the Paris Agreement does is to allow countries to cooperate when it comes to their climate commitments. Now, that could be a country that goes further than their ambition, and they could essentially trade the difference between their level of commitment under the Paris Agreement and the level that they actually got to with another jurisdiction. It could be a country that, for example, has a lot of rainforest or has potential for land usage change and actually could, through nature-based solutions, could actually make sure that there's a more of a carbon sink within their jurisdiction. So, and trade that with another country or with a different entity. So there's lots of different possibilities. Now, when it comes to the EU, the sort of cornerstone of EU climate policy is the EU's emissions trading system, which is its carbon pricing system. Now, primarily, this has been just a domestic mechanism. There are a couple of countries which are sort of linked to it now. So we've got Norway, of course, that's under the EEA, and now we've got Switzerland more recently. But until Article 6 was finalised, there really wasn't a framework for actually how to do this. Every time the EU wanted to form a relationship with another jurisdiction, a third country, when it came to carbon markets, they had to do so bilaterally, have a kind of singular bilateral negotiation, which was, quite difficult, sometimes quite political. Now that we've seen Article 6 actually be finalised, there's a huge amount of scope for the EU to exploit this and actually to ensure that they can bring other countries with them on that journey to climate neutrality. Article 6 allows a set of different cooperative mechanisms. It could be through linking your emissions trading system. It could, as I say, be through exploiting, power generation in another jurisdiction. It could be through carbon capture and storage capacity in another jurisdiction. It could be that one country has capacity for removals through nature-based solutions, whatever it may be. Now, at the moment, I think there's a relatively low level of understanding of this because, of course, this has just been finalized, but there is real scope here. And I think ultimately, if the EU wants to continue this shift kind of from the domestic to the international in the way it looks at climate and its ability to incentivize other countries to take action, then utilizing carbon markets through this umbrella of Article 6 is probably going to be really critical, because, as I say, there is no other international mechanism that exists for countries to cooperate at scale. So that's why I think that's going to be really important. And when it comes to the UK, as you mentioned, the UK set up their own domestic emissions trading system after Brexit. At the moment, the EU and UK structures are entirely separate. That seems a little bizarre, given that they've got, exactly the same level of ambition when it comes to climate neutrality, very similar targets even for 2030. So my guess would be that eventually we will end up in a situation in which those two jurisdictions are tied probably a bit closer together, at least in a carbon market sense.
Thank you, Mr. Berman. I think we have around 10 minutes, and Ms. van Veldhoven, I want to ask you about the cooperation, the inclusiveness of actually the climate change efforts, let's say. The Green Deal has an overarching aim to leave no one behind while achieving climate neutrality across the continent. For example, the deal proposed the Just Transition Fund, which will support European regions most affected by the transition by enabling economic development, diversification, and helping people adapt to a changing labor market. How does this commitment to just transition work for the non-EU world, particularly in terms of supporting the underdeveloped countries in need of assistance for transition? What does the deal offer for global climate equity?
Well, I think, and I'll try to be brief, because with 10 more minutes and 3 speakers, which you surely want to give a final round, I think this should be a pointy answer. I think, as Rob matter, developed countries just need to make good on their commitment. Right? The commitment was there to deliver 100 billion annually in climate finance for these countries, and that will enable them to leave no one behind, right? At least that's a start. Because even that 100 billion will not be enough. This was, of course, supposed to happen by 2020, but it is really behind schedule. So it will really be essential to close this gap as soon as possible, and then to find ways also to make for the past shortfalls. And that's just really critical for the developing countries, to enable them to make the energy transition we need take place. It's also crucial for trust. Our entire climate discussions at COP depend on the trust that we have that each of the partners will deliver their part of the deal. And this 100 billion annually was part of the deal. So we need to step up, and we really need to make sure that we help those countries go through that transition and do it in a just way. So that really, like the example that I gave with the coal-fired power plants, it's easy to close down a coal-fired power plant, right? But lots of people depend on it for their livelihoods. And if I look at the Netherlands, there was a court case, and we had to close down coal-fired power plants quickly to be in line with this court case. And even in a wealthy country like the Netherlands, right, it was not easy to make sure that the people who actually work there get the treatment which they also deserve, to make sure that they can also make the transition to a different part of the economy. Because yes, there are other jobs, but they may be different jobs, and they may be in different region, right? So we need to take a people-centered approach, and for that, those commitments to deliver 100 billion annually are just crucial. So if there's anything I'd like you to take away finally, is what can others do? Let's make sure that we get the money there.
Thank you, Ms. van Veldhoven. It was fast and insightful. Mr. Van Aert, the African continent has featured prominently in recent discussions around the European Green Deal, particularly as a potential source of raw materials needed as inputs for green technologies. What are the implications for EU foreign relations, not only with African states, but with other international players in Africa?
Well, let's focus on the theme of equity here. I think indeed, of course, there are demands in the EU for African resources. But what we cannot have is a scenario that we impose a CBAM. We also put out international signals that it's no longer sustainable to invest in, for instance, gas. And also request them to send the critical minerals that we need to Europe. I think that's going off kilter here. Here, I think we need to be very careful in how we do this, and I think indeed the signaling that emanates from discussions on the taxonomy or international financial institutions, the European Investment Bank no longer investing in gas, is somewhat unfortunate if you look from the outside in. I think African ministers have said that indeed Europe is sitting on the top of the roof. African nations are on the ground floor and need a ladder to get at those levels of development. But it seems that Europe is taking away the ladder by imposing those policy choices on them. So there, I think there is still a lot of dialogue and work to do.
Thank you, Mr. Van Aert. We wish we had more time to dig into these issues more, but I just have one more question to Mr. Berman. Mr. Berman, what kinds of policy options does the EU have to mitigate the environmental risks associated with increased mining for rare earth minerals and metals that will be needed in the EU's push towards carbon neutrality?
Well, to be honest, I'm not an expert when it comes to the extraction of minerals. I mean, I think the EU is starting to move into the question of supply chains, but I think globally we're still at a relatively early stage when it comes to actually, I think as Christoph said earlier, calculating carbon intensity of products, regulating it, or at least inspecting it between different jurisdictions, facilities, regulatory regimes. So I think ultimately it will be a problematic road. So let me just maybe end by also just saying a little bit on equity, because I think we seem to have ended up in this space. I think clearly there is a commitment, as Stientje says, for the EU and for other advanced economies to abide by their pledges. But there are signs, I think, of late, which I think have concerned some stakeholders, that the question of equity has been a little bit of an afterthought in European policymaking. It's striking that the European Commission's proposal for the carbon border adjustment mechanism does not exempt least developed economies. I'm almost certain that will change in the final policy, but nonetheless, that was the Commission's position. They didn't propose recycling the revenue to send it to least developed economies or to aid with just transition. Equally, on a more domestic focus, there was a particular policy suggested which would help to decarbonize the road transport and building sectors. And it has become very political within the EU. And it was very clear to, I think, all that, again, the European Commission was sent scrambling. And just a few weeks before this policy was suggested, they came up with a sort of just transition fund called the Social Climate Fund. So I think, it's good to see that there is some movement, but I do think we've got further to go, not just in showing others internationally that if the EU is going to lead by example, it must lead domestically in helping domestic communities to transition, but also abiding by its pledges. And when it comes to the effect of something like the carbon border adjustment mechanism on international communities, not just saying to countries that we will penalize you effectively for not being an advanced economy, but saying to them, we will help you on that journey. As far as we can, with as many mechanisms as possible, with revenue, with assistance when it comes to technical expertise. These are the types of things that I think we should be moving into in the EU, and I think with any luck, we're hopefully slowly moving in that direction.
Thank you, Mr. Berman. I think we are in the end. It was so insightful, informative, and also complicated. Thank you for coming. I hope we can meet again in our future events. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for having us.
Bye-bye.